Every year, our veterans group decides on a theme for the service, and recently we have chosen themes like the impact of military service on our lives, our later thoughts about where we were, and coming home. There's a pattern here that this year's theme, Coming to Terms After the War, also reflects. Military service in war and peace usually has a dramatic impact on our lives, of those involved, wherever they might have served. We live with it for the rest of our lives, and we want to talk about it and listen to others. Today, we will explore this idea further. We will hear readings from veterans about healing and homelessness after the war, as well as feeling lucky about surviving and improvement in the treatment of veterans after the war.
My name is Dave Duckworth. I served in the U.S. Naval Reserve from September 71 to March 75. Mine is the story of someone lucky enough to avoid that shiftless, vague struggle between the U.S. military machine and the Viet Cong guerrillas. My life was never threatened by ambushes or landmines, nor was I exposed to malarial mosquitoes, leeches, fire ants, or venomous snakes amidst monsoon rains. Marijuana, opium, morphine, and heroin weren't readily available, and I never wondered if local civilians working on base in the day were behind guns trying to kill me at night. I was raised on a cattle ranch in west central Missouri near the tiny town of Amoret. My farm property line was adjacent to the Kansas City Southern Railroad track, and we could catch a ride to Kansas City or New Orleans with the wave of a hat and cash for a ticket. My family did it one time. As required by law, I registered for selective service on August 8, 1967, the day I turned 18. Soon after, I began work on my Bachelor of Science in Agricultural Economics at the University of Missouri. By 1969, anti-war protests were in full swing. On December 1st of my junior year, I stood in a jam-packed student union to watch the televised lottery of the first U.S. military conscription since 1942. All across America, males born between 1944 and 1950 were tuned in. Anyone whose birth date was matched with a number lower than 196 would soon get a letter ordering them to report for possible induction into military service. My draft number was 48. My libertarian dad encouraged me to do everything possible to avoid Vietnam while upholding my civic duty. Military recruiters blanketed the campus, offering a variety of ways to manage my draft status. After 2 days of physical and mental assessment, I proudly repeated the oath of enlistment and signed up for Naval Officer Candidate School, agreeing to serve an additional 18 months in a way to avoid the Asian Pacific. After graduating, I reported to Naval Officer Training Center in Newport, Rhode Island, and 90 days of autumn in New England. When training ended, 3 options were presented: select my ship type, aircraft carrier, submarine, or destroyer, or my billet, specific job, or on which ocean to serve. I chose to serve the Atlantic and was assigned to anti-submarine warfare. The second week of November, I stepped off a plane in sunny Key West, Florida, specialized training at Fleet Sonar School. Then, as the cherry blossoms opened, I was ordered to Norfolk, Virginia to serve on the USS Steinecker DD-863, a Gearing-class destroyer. In June, we deployed to 7 northern European countries in and around the Baltic Sea as part of the United States effort to protect our NATO allies during the Cold War. We tracked down Soviet submarines and got buzzed by MiGs. Standing on the bridge as officer of the deck in control of a fully loaded 4,000-ton ship felt both exhilarating and terrifying. During multinational exercises, ordering the launch of anti-submarine rockets and torpedoes, or taking evasive maneuvers against enemy torpedoes required intense focus. There was always a slim but real possibility that a geopolitical crisis may have occurred in the last 24 hours, making one side's warheads live. No video game compared. I got to explore Copenhagen, Denmark, Helsinki, Finland, Stavanger, Norway, on foot. I pedaled the Scottish Highlands with a bike I bought in Hamburg, Germany, and stowed on the ship. From Amsterdam, a group visited Bruges, Belgium, a city distinguished by cobbled streets, canals, and medieval structures. From Portsmouth, England, we took in the sights of London as well as Stonehenge. The ship then sailed to Brooklyn Navy Yard for dry dock repairs, where I served as the Force Overhaul Systems Manager. Perks of the job included Broadway plays and fine restaurants. I attended classes on theology at a church which I wish had been UU, before being honorably discharged with GI benefits to spend.
As I was searching for appropriate songs to sing at the vet service this year, I came across a unique program called Songwriting with Soldiers. Songwriting with Soldiers is a nonprofit organization that pairs veterans from all branches of the military with professional songwriters. Singer-songwriter Darden Smith pioneered this innovative therapeutic program and co-founded the nonprofit organization with Mary Judd in 2012. Since its inception, Songwriting with Soldiers has held more than 50 retreats and custom workshops at locations across the U.S., attracting more than 700 attendees. They create a safe and inspiring environment which allows veterans to open up and share their stories in a creative way. Some attendees have described the process as a spiritual experience. The program has since expanded to include songwriting retreats for military families, military couples, and Gold Star families. The program has positively impacted thousands of community members. Now, during these 3-day retreats and workshops, professional songwriters are paired with veterans. The songwriting process involves a songwriter interviewing a veteran as he or she describes their combat experience and their feelings transitioning back home. The songwriter listens and creates the lyrics and the music, and together they craft a song that tells a personal story and serves as healing therapy. The emotional connection between all retreat attendees grows as each veteran shares their vulnerability and acknowledges their pain and their struggles. Sometimes painful memories surface, but the veterans felt that by converting their stories to songs, it helped them to better deal with their emotions and to release some of their pain. This, in turn, assisted them in better dealing with their anger that could overtake them when confronted with the daily frustrations of life. The process fosters trust, creativity, and healing. Many of the soldiers said that they shared personal stories with the musicians that they had never disclosed to anyone else. They felt the recording process moved their hearts and helped them to share their difficult-to-talk-about stories with loved ones, some of whom were hearing details for the first time through their song. The new songs are performed by the musicians on the final day of the workshop and professionally recorded. The veterans are listed as co-writers of the song and are registered with the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers. A research study led by 2 Harvard Medical School faculty members and 2 Massachusetts general clinicians explores the impacts of this program on the participants. They found that 4 weeks after the songwriting sessions, study participants reported a 33% reduction in PTSD symptoms and a 22% decrease in depression symptoms. Future studies are planned that will examine what might be causing these therapeutic effects. The lead author in the study said, "It's a little unclear as to what exactly is helpful about this collaborative songwriting experience. The study was really to see, does collaborative songwriting help veterans? We didn't really ask the question, what is it about collaborative songwriting that helps them feel better? The songwriting process and subsequent listening to the songs may function as a kind of exposure therapy, which is an established technique veterans experience their trauma in a therapeutic setting, which can reduce the potency of their memories. Blair Moran, an Air Force medic who served 2 combat tours attached to infantry units, was one of the servicemen that participated in the program. He said he really looked forward to hearing his song, saying, "I was actually listening to it twice most days. I have about an hour-long commute to work, so it was really easy when I started getting frustrated with traffic or anything else throughout my workday to put the song on, and it kind of grounded me. It made me think, traffic sucks. I'm going to get through it, though, and my day could get better from here." My wife listens to it regularly. The songwriter brought up how his PSD has affected his family. He goes, "That's the part that really hit home for me. I remember right before I started the treatment, we took our children to Stewbridge Village to see Santa. I had to leave. There were too many crowds." In conclusion, he said, "I'm a good dad now. I have it in me, with a little more treatment, to be a great dad." Finally, Christine Brooks is another veteran who took part in the songwriting program. She's an Air Force veteran who served in the first Gulf War. She works at Clarksville, Tennessee's VA clinic as a registered nurse. She said, "The songwriter asked me questions trying to figure out what my story was. I knew there were a couple of things I wanted to bring to light in my song, but at the same time, I didn't know what my story was." The songwriter also interviewed Christine's son, who filled in some of the pieces. The songwriter said that her son seemed to know better than his mother how the song should go. Sometimes a person living the experience can't see it.
I'm going to talk to you today about how much the VA has improved since I came back from Vietnam. I returned in 1970, and all through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, the VA had a reputation of shoddy and inconsistent care at its health centers. But by 1995, there was pressure from Congress and the Clinton White House to reform the whole VA health system. With legislation in 1995 and 1996, the whole system was restructured. With better funding and leadership from a reformer at the head of the Department of Veterans Affairs, the quality of care greatly improved by 2000. In addition to more staff and satellite clinics, like the one I go to in North Aurora, there were also more services available closer to where veterans live by the turn of this century. There was also a push to change the focus of the VA treatment to include wellness care without sacrificing the earlier emphasis on hospital and acute care. And with the expansion of lifetime whole care came a new emphasis on mental health services, PSD and also PTSD, and suicide prevention, and all of that was very much used by us Vietnam veterans. All this was made easier to fund because of new awareness of the physical and emotional sacrifices that those in uniform face. There was also a reaction to the lack of respect soldiers returning from the Vietnam conflict endured. In my case, I have shared before that I was quiet about being a Vietnam combat veteran for the first 10 years after I returned from Vietnam in 1970. And it was not until the Vietnam Memorial was finished in 1982 that I saw public opinion begin to change, with fellow citizens supporting our troops whether or not they supported the policies that led to their deployment and involvement in a conflict. It also was not until about that time that major veterans organizations fully backed more VA benefits for Vietnam veterans in the annual VA budget. With the change of public opinion about supporting veterans and the push to restructure and modernize the VA, the changes that were in place by 2000 continued into this century. Today, the VA has a much better reputation of meeting the specific medical needs of veterans. Based on 560,000 recent survey answers, 90% of veterans that get their care from the VA trust the VA for their care. Of course, it's not perfect, and there are always areas where the VA falls short. Any institution that large is going to have administrative problems that need to be addressed. We need to be vigilant when there are places that the VA does not live up to the level of care we citizens expect for our veterans. But I must say that I have had excellent care at Hines and my local Aurora clinic. They have been kind and professional. And most importantly, I am grateful that they emphasize keeping me both physically and mentally healthy, with a focus on the 3 diseases I have related to exposure to Agent Orange and the lasting effects of combat trauma. Before I close, I do want to add that the focus of VA is to care for the health and well-being of a veteran. But the VA will never be able to provide enough for the other needs veterans have, like housing and employment services. So that is why our society also has a need for organizations like our BOW choice this month, the Midwest Shelter for Homeless Veterans at Wheaton. I reported earlier the VA works with a shelter program of the VA called Supportive Services for Veterans and Families, which was developed to help veterans and veterans' families plagued by homelessness. And there are other programs which the VA helps fund in partnership with various privately funded institutions. So we still need to support those private programs in our local communities which meet these veterans' needs that the VA alone cannot provide. As we enter this season of Thanksgiving, it's important to be thankful this Veterans Day that we have a government and private programs geared to meeting these special challenges that veterans face. I, for one, am very grateful for the support of our community and our government in recognizing the need for these services for us veterans, and will continue to strive as we strive to live a healthy, productive, and rewarding life here back home.
There's a story about an aging war veteran in Vermont named Jeffrey Brace, who applied for a federal pension. He was blind, impoverished, and desperate, but the federal government rejected his request on a bureaucratic technicality. Brace could not properly prove his combat service. 3 long years later, officials finally approved his pension, but by then Brace only had 6 years to live. At about the same time, another aging combat veteran named Joseph Plum Martin from Becket, Massachusetts, also applied for a federal pension. He was poor and owned absolutely nothing. Martin was more successful, receiving a small pension for life on the first try, and he lived a lot longer and was recognized as a hero, but he never escaped poverty. These stories are not about veterans of Vietnam or more recent wars. They were veterans of the Revolutionary War, fought from 1775 to 1783. The image and reality of down and out, impoverished, and homeless veterans is as old as this country. In 1818, 35 years after the war ended, the U.S. government realized that many veterans were still alive and struggling, so they passed a federal pension law granting individuals $96 per year for life if they could prove they had served honorably in the Revolutionary War. And 60,000 veterans applied for pensions. $96 a year wasn't much, but it made a difference to those struggling against poverty and old age. Joseph Plum Martin certainly was a combat veteran. He joined the militia when he was 15 years old in 1775, and 2 years later he joined George Washington's Continental Army. He did this when recruitment was difficult. Nobody wanted to go. The war was so difficult and so dangerous. He did it to escape struggling family circumstances. He fought in many major campaigns, and he was always in the thick of it. He was at New York City, the campaign there, Brandywine, Monmouth Courthouse. He endured smallpox, dysentery, and other miseries. He drilled with the famous Prussian general Steuben. He fought with Lafayette. He witnessed the espionage involving Benedict Arnold and Major Andre. He endured terrible conditions and suffering during the winters at Valley Forge in Morristown. And he was part of the mutiny in response to the poor treatment and conditions. At the climatic victory at Yorktown, Martin referred to his unit as a band of brotherhood. He was discharged in 1783 at the war's end after 6 years of hard fighting. Thereafter, he became a teacher, married, had kids, but he remained poor. He could never get the land that was promised him. He was swindled by a former Continental Army general. By 1818, when he applied for the pension, he owned nothing. He published his memoir in 1830 to support other struggling veterans. And 2 years later, a new pension law provided more assistance for those still living. With some bitterness, his memoir lists all unfulfilled promises to him and the other soldiers. Martin died in 1850, aged 89, still poor, but he was recognized as a hero and celebrated with many other veterans of the day. It was more difficult if you were black. Jeffrey Brace's African name was Boyero Brench. He was a slave ship survivor who came from the middle Niger Valley and now in the modern West African state of Mali. He was captured at age 16 in 1758 and taken on a slave ship to Barbados. There he survived the so-called House of Subjection. He fought in the 7 Years' War in the Caribbean as an enslaved sailor on a British warship. After that, his owner took him to Connecticut and sold him. In 1777, he enlisted in the Continental Army to reacquire his freedom. That was part of the deal. You could get out of slavery if you enlisted in the Army. He fought in the New York City campaign at Hackensack, Monmouth Courthouse, West Point, Princeton, and in many other battles, and he was wounded at least once. Once he fought hand-to-hand against a mounted British officer who was trying to take him as a slave. The famous patriot Roger Sherman cheated him out of a saddle. He was discharged in 1783 at war's end, but was not manumitted for another year. Brench married an African woman, was baptized, and bought land in the new state of Vermont. He faced poverty and terrible racism in the first territory that abolished slavery. His neighbors seized his kids, attacked his wife, destroyed his farm equipment, cheated him, and forced him to move again and again. By 1810, Brench was blind, nearly 70 years old. He was a pious Christian, and he was an abolitionist. He told his story to show how badly African Americans were being treated in New England. His memoir, called The Blind African Slave, assisted the abolition movement but brought him no money. 2 years later, in 1812, he was warned out of his home in Milton, Vermont. He received the pension in 1821 in part because surviving comrades from his old unit came to support him. And in 1827, Brench died recognized as a Revolutionary War veteran and a hero, and the pension did alleviate some of his poverty. This sort of thing, impoverishment, homelessness, disillusionment among veterans, has occurred after every American war. along with recognition of suffering and accomplishments. It has become a familiar refrain, and we are dealing with it yet again following the many wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which keep the Midwest Shelter for Homeless Veterans very busy. While we recognize the accomplishments of veterans, we need to raise awareness of their struggles. And doing something about it now can make a difference, just as it did, at least a little, 200 years ago. Thank you.
First, I want to start by saying thank you to our veterans for putting on today's experience. Personally, I know how much effort goes into doing this, and I just want to pause and say, on behalf of myself, my own family, and for you, thank you for everything that you've done this morning. To the rest of you, I want to say thank you for coming today. I know this service means a lot to our veterans, and they appreciate your support. Speaking a little personally, my grandfather served in World War II in the Navy. My brother and father both served in the Army. My father got called up in 1967, came back in 68, and strangely enough, I was born 9 months later. Two of my uncles served in Nam. One of them was a Marine. And until I was medically disqualified by asthma, it was my dream to become a military cop. I have no idea. And for those of you that were curious, as I was looking at the Air Force, and no comments necessary from the Navy or the Army. So growing up, there were no stories about war, no war stories at all told in my house. My father and his brothers may have reminisced about this, but if that was so, it was never in front of us kids. I like to think that they were satisfied with what they had accomplished, but maybe not exactly proud. I have no idea. But what I remember is those calm and competent men. And that's what I remember of military life. What I was told, because I did ask, was that it was impossible to understand what military service is like, not until you have done it. I was also told that this knowledge is something that the rest of us who did not serve would never serve, something we didn't need to know, at least not fully, because that's kind of the point, that this time, that work, that sacrifice is something the rest of us are only supposed to intuit, something we infer, something maybe we can grasp after, and that's it. We are welcome to be inspired, and we should, and that's enough, because that's what service means. And the fact is, at least in part, that's why our gratitude is owed. I want to offer this too. No military person I have ever met believes that a militarized society is a good thing. No soldiers on our streets, not now, not ever. More, many of them dream of a life where a military is not necessary, a day when war is no more. Until that day, this life that we get to enjoy, this work of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, this long arc toward justice, equity, and peace, this is something that nearly every American, in uniform and out, wants to preserve and cherish and celebrate. And that is worth remembering, I think. And so it is that in our collective journey, our family, friends, and neighbors who have served in the U.S. Armed Forces, our veterans, are very much worthy of our respect, our gratitude, and our thanks. And that is, at least in part, what today is about. I want us all to take in this moment, these people, our family, our friends, our neighbors, our community. This is one part of our great interdependent web. And once again, to the veterans, thank you. And to all of you who support our veterans, thank you, and amen. Remain standing for the playing of taps.